The way that Americans live and work is changing. City planning experts say that the U.S. is undergoing a huge corporate migration of offices and jobs out to the suburbs. Although the clean, fresh air has breathed new life into business, not everyone is enjoying the trip out of the city. Steve Kaufman reports.
Americans are once again on the move. The first time was just after World War II, when families bought new homes in the suburbs. This time, the pioneer spirit is being summoned by big business. Business is reshaping the American landscape. 2/3 of new office construction in the United States now takes place in the suburbs. So much so that this rapid trend, underway for only 10 years, has given a new name to suburban communities all over the country. These developments are now called urban villages. This massive exodus started when business found lower rents and more space for expansion away from the crowded cities. Companies are leaving the central cities in droves, headed for these new suburban downtowns. Like this one on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., Tysons Corner, Virginia, 12 miles from Washington. It's on its way to becoming the 10th largest downtown in the nation, employing 60,000 workers. It offers 20 million square feet of office space for almost 50% less than the rent prices paid in downtown Washington. And jobs here are increasing by 3 times the downtown rate. But nothing comes that cheap without someone paying the difference. It's the employee that's bearing a new burden, getting to work. Kenneth Orski, president of a Washington-based transportation consulting firm, explains.
This has led in turn to a much greater usage of the private automobile for the commute trip to work. And that in turn has led to growing congestion on our highways, growing traffic jams, delays, and the attendant, of course, frustration and loss of productivity of our labor force. These are what is commonly referred to today as the urban traffic gridlock.
The gridlock arises because these business districts are unplanned. They spring up suddenly as business relocates. But the problem of accommodating the increased commuter traffic goes unanswered.
Tysons Corner is almost a symbol of an unplanned suburban downtown that has created tremendous transportation problems. Tysons Corner, which did not exist, virtually speaking, 15 years ago, is now larger in terms of employment than the downtown of the capital of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Economist Anthony Downs of the Brookings Institution in Washington suggests this high-tech, high-rise outcrop of business should be carefully designed.
It's a mess, and it was planned, it looks like it was planned by idiots, because there's no coordination whatsoever of all the activities. Each office building is a completely isolated thing from all the others around it, unlike downtown. So it's the most inefficient possible use of space you could imagine. But that was, in that sense, I think it's the most extreme example of sort of not too well done sprawl that you could find in the country that I know of.
Hand in hand with the now inadequate roads is the absence of a transit system that can effectively service these outlying clusters. That, coupled with a lack of affordable housing in the suburbs, keeps employees on the road 5% longer with each year.
In the long run, the way to cope with congestion is to learn to enjoy it. Get an air-conditioned car with a stereo radio and a telephone and a nice companion and just relax in the traffic jams, because you really cannot eliminate them.
Europeans don't have the problem yet, but it's coming to a city near them soon.
Centers of European cities are also becoming extremely congested, and as the economies of European nations expand, more and more offices will have to be accommodated on the outskirts of the cities. So we are seeing new concentrations of employment, such as La Défense in Paris, which now rival, to some extent, the downtown concentrations.
Despite the problems, companies are still drawn to the mini-cities. The overall shift in the American economy from manufacturing to service industries has paved the way for this trend. Service industries can relocate easily away from the traditional downtown because of telecommunications. By the year 2000, 90% of all jobs in the U.S. may be in these office-related jobs.
As our economy expands, the urban villages will grow in size and importance, and will, in many metropolitan areas, probably begin to rival the traditional downtowns as centers for employment and economic activity.
And when they become too crowded, another wave will begin, away from these suburbs, giving rise to more urban villages. As this spillover to the suburbs continues, the traditional downtown will be left as just one of several centers of business in cities all across America. Steve Kaufman, America Today, Washington.
Tonight, President Reagan is before Congress with his annual State of the Union address. Steve Kaufman looks back on the history of this message, which is called for by the Constitution of the United States.
The United States Constitution begins with three important words: we, the people. It is by this authority that our country is ruled. The Constitution, housed in the rotunda of the National Archives in Washington, contains a section which specifies that Congress, and thus the people, shall be informed about important information pertaining to the nation. Specifically, Article 2, Section 3 states that the President shall from time to time give to Congress information of the State of the Union.
Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, the Constitution wisely provides that the Chief Executive shall report to the Congress on the State of the Union.
It started out at the very beginning as an annual address. George Washington established that precedent, and it was, in those days, it was simply called the annual message. It wasn't called the State of the Union address until 1945.
According to historian Raymond Smock, once Thomas Jefferson became the third president, a 113-year period began where presidents sent only written messages to Congress on the State of the Union.
Exactly. I think there were several reasons why Jefferson didn't want to come up before the Congress. One is he did think that this appeared too much as if it was the king going before Parliament.
Moving into the 1800s, President Abraham Lincoln was faced with the end of the Civil War and a separated Union, a difficult yet opportune time to give an important message to the Congress on the abolition of slavery.
One of his most memorable speeches in 1862, where he talked about freeing the slaves and the importance of freeing the slaves meant that if you freed the slaves, then the free would also be free. It was one of the most memorable State of the Union addresses ever.
During the early 1900s, with World War I raging in Europe, President Woodrow Wilson resumed addressing Congress in person. A practice continued thereafter. It was the stock market crash in 1929 and the Great Depression that followed which helped Franklin D. Roosevelt win the presidency over Herbert Hoover. His New Deal policies captured the American public, who are now able to hear the address on radio.
Brings me to the problem of what the government should do with approximately 5 million unemployed now on the relief roll. It is not empty optimism that moves me to a strong hope in the coming year.
The 1950s brought a new set of problems needing attention. President Harry S. Truman sent U.S. troops to Korea in an effort to contain the spread of communism in Asia.
As we meet here today, American soldiers are fighting a bitter campaign in Korea. We pay tribute to their courage, devotion, and gallantry.
Truman's successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, found his 2 terms as president focused on a new type of hostility, the Cold War with the Soviet Union.
The policy we pursue will recognize the truth that no single country, even one so powerful as ours, can alone defend the liberty of all nations threatened by communist aggression from without or subversion within.
During the early 1960s, when the Cuban Missile Crisis had the entire world concerned about a global war, a young president responded to the Soviet threat, John F. Kennedy.
A year ago, in assuming the task of the presidency, I said that few generations in all history had been granted the role of being the great defender of freedom in its hour of maximum danger. This is our good fortune, and I welcome it now. as I did a year ago.
I think President John F. Kennedy was one of our most effective public speakers among the presidents. Certainly his State of the Union addresses were captured the rhetoric, and had a ring to them that was very effective.
For it is the fate of this generation, of you in the Congress, and of me as President, to live with a struggle we did not start, in a world we did not make. But the pressures of life are not always distributed by choice, and while no nation has ever faced such a challenge, no nation has ever been so ready to seize the burden and the glory of freedom. And in this high endeavor, may God watch over the United States of America.
Tonight, President Reagan comes to Capitol Hill to address the 100th Congress and the nation in his 6th State of the Union address. Last year, the president had to delay his remarks for 2 weeks because of the space shuttle tragedy. Tonight, presidential advisors say it's likely the president's remarks will be about terrorism and the Iran-Contra affair, issues on the mind of the American public. Steve Kaufman, WorldNet.
Well, today here in the United States, we celebrate the 255th birthday of our first president, George Washington. Well, as Steve Kaufman reports, historians say that President Washington would rather have been a Virginia farmer than a founding father. Well, 1 million people each year see why.
Mount Vernon. This is how George Washington always pictured the estate would look in later years, as he spent his early childhood here. The memories formed his fond attachment to Mount Vernon that he would never lose. It was smaller then, when his brother Lawrence owned it. Lawrence had built it and named it. He invited George to live here after their father died. George accepted, and his life's unshakable commitment to this place began. I visited with the Mount Vernon historian, Christina Meadows. She told us about Washington's love affair with running this farm.
He took a small house that his father had built and developed it into the house that you see behind me, relayed the grounds, created the little dependencies running off the lanes from the mansion, the pleasure grounds. But oddly enough, he was away from Mount Vernon 16 years of his life, 8 during the Revolution and 8 during the presidency. At the height of Mount Vernon's development, probably 2,000 people, slaves, indentured servants, his family, people to whom he had rented property, who were really, he was sort of overseeing their lives and their activities. It was a formidable job, like being the head of a great corporation.
Washington was legendary for such leadership. That was the key to his success in the Revolutionary War for freedom from England. He was the one strong, dependable force for the unity of a young United States. He was unanimously elected president and served 2 terms.
But you have a sense in reading descriptions left by people who visited him and knew him of his enormous presence and dignity. It wasn't just his size. He was very tall for that period at 6'2½". The average man, I guess, was about 5'8", 5'9". And he did tower above most of his contemporaries.
But Washington's prowess as a leader was always overshadowed by his passion to own one of the first great farms in colonial America. He thought he would quietly retire here with his wife Martha. In fact, he was hesitant to leave Mount Vernon to become the first president of the nation when his country called. He even compared farming to laying the foundation of America when he said, "Liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth."
Yes, I think he accepted with great reluctance, although Washington had an enormous sense of his responsibility to accept public duty.
He did, however, refuse to consider a 3rd term, and finally, at age 65, he came back to Mount Vernon for the last time. It had suffered through his absence, so there was much work to do.
And then he spent the rest of his time just sort of refining Mount Vernon. And in fact, one of his particular interests was opening up the vistas or views up and down the river. And that essentially is what brought on his death, because he had been out on a cold, rainy, snowy day and was late getting back to the house and didn't change his clothes for dinner and sat through the meal with a wet collar. I think
the harsh weather in those days could be fatal, and Washington died at age 67.
When he was away during the presidency, he wrote to his manager and said that he had no problem with orderly, respectable people touring the grounds. I think he would enjoy it, and Mrs. Washington, too.
Washington's home somehow calls people here from all around the world.
Not only the American public, but a great many of our visitors from overseas come here really to see how and where George Washington lived.
In the United States, there is a constant flow of young people as a pilgrimage to learn about their first president.
Historical people I learned today are just like us. They're just regular people. It's just so neat to feel that you are here where he was before. I never dreamed of it.
Well, he was a pretty popular guy.
They come to a place like here, and all of a sudden history comes to life. It's, the guy actually ate food, he slept in a bed, he had a wife, he had children, he did things. He was a normal human being.
If George Washington were alive today, he would not be too surprised that his birthday is being honored as a national holiday. That's because even in his own lifetime, Washington's birthday was celebrated by a young nation, rallying behind their first president. At Mount Vernon, Virginia, Steve Kaufman, WorldNet.
Millions of Americans, roughly 25% of the population, head for the great outdoors to spend their vacations. Now, in part one of his two-part series on traveling in the U.S., reporter Steve Kaufman tells us that more and more international visitors are packing up their gear and going camping across America.
Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, famous for its wondrous geysers, was established in 1872. It was the world's first example of large-scale preservation of land for the enjoyment of the nation's people. Since that birth of the national park idea, 337 sites have been set aside in the U.S. for the benefit of all to visit, and they have. Last year, parks across America were visited 360 million times. Many of those visitors are international tourists. Tourists have discovered that traveling America while camping in its national parks is an inexpensive method of seeing a great part of America that you surely miss if you stay in motels and ride sightseeing buses. It is also a unique way to make new friends. Here in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park, man and wildlife live side by side. Park Ranger Teresa Shirakawa recommends this type of vacation.
We see quite a number of international visitors, families going through our national parks, and I've worked in several national parks. And national parks have made an effort to have information, publications, brochures available in different languages.
Tourists from overseas find the park rangers ready to assist them.
As far as international tourists are concerned, we find in talking with them that much of the environment is pretty much the same. The mountains, the streams, the ability to get away from the crowds, to be able to walk along a brook, watch fish in the stream, enjoy the natural environments that they find themselves in.
2 million visitors came to Shenandoah last year to enjoy the subtle beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains and its vast stretches of forest, housing over 100 species of trees. At home in the wilderness, there's an abundance of wildflowers, wildlife, and families enjoying the environment. For the Jones family, it's a way to spend time with each other.
It's a good way to get your family together with no TV.
The sheer scenic beauty of its hills and valleys makes all the rigors of camping more fun than work. Camping certainly requires some outdoor skills, but it has its rewards.
Well, I guess it's an inexpensive alternative for vacation, given the cost of vacationing and all.
The Hazard family has been camping since they were kids.
We met in 1937 and got married in 38, and we've been camping ever since with our 3 sons and carrying on the tradition, you might say.
Also here is the Appalachian Trail, the largest continuous hiking trail in the U.S., spanning from Maine to Georgia. We met a man who calls himself Ridge Runner, who's been trekking it for 5 months. Why is he doing it?
Just to be out in the wilderness and be in the quiet and the freedom of the outdoors.
Shenandoah, as other national parks, offers its varied visitors different ways to stay in the park, in their recreational vehicles, by pitching tents, or renting a cabin. Either way, families spend time together, seeing America from its immense treasured lands. If you're planning a trip to the United States this summer or fall, traveling through the national parks would surely be an exciting yet inexpensive way of seeing America the Beautiful. Tomorrow in Part 2, we'll explore private camping as an alternative to traveling America. Steve Kaufman, WorldNet.
Turning our attention now to a different, perhaps a more pleasant sort of traveling. Reporter Steve Kaufman takes us back to his series on traveling in the U.S. and now talks about camping amidst the great beauty of the U.S. National Park System. Well, that's what he was talking about yesterday anyway. Today, Steve's going to tell us about another way to camp in America that's a little less, well, back to nature.
If you'd like to experience the great outdoors on your vacation, but feel your camping skills are a little rusty, you might try touring America by staying at its private campgrounds. We visited this one in Annapolis, Maryland. It's part of Campgrounds of America, or KOA, the largest system of private campsites in the U.S., serving 700 locations. For 25 years, they have been called the Holiday Inn of camping because of the support facilities they provide. Most travelers arrive in recreational vehicles, mobile homes with many of the conveniences of home. Judging by these RVs, you can tell which folks are more rugged than others. Others still prefer to be closer to the earth. Either way, such a vacation offers time to be with nature, relaxing in the peace and quiet. Since the 1960s, a growing number of outdoor enthusiasts have enjoyed amenities such as electricity, hot showers, laundries, and playgrounds on these sites. These are services not always available in the national parks, so a little less roughing it is required on your part. The general store sells almost anything a camper might have left behind. It also reminds us of two of the best reasons to stay at a private campground. One, they are very inexpensive, averaging $15 a night for a family of 4. And they are located in the countryside, on interstate highways, close to major U.S. cities. This campground is located 22 miles from the nation's capital, with great sightseeing nearby. Campgrounds have become an alternative to motels. Owner Helen Foxwell.
For instance, here at this campground, our major attraction is Washington, D.C. So they're not here to necessarily camp under a tree as much as they are to have a good, clean, safe place to stay while they tour a city.
The traveling flexibility attracts international tourists, taking their holiday outdoors. This is the 4th camping trip to the U.S. for Phil Thorne and his family from Canada. Do they have the comforts of home?
We
as
have
many as we
most
can
things.
carry.
As much as we can.
But sure, you miss the comforts of home.
10-year-old Matthew likes the freedom.
It's a lot better camping in campgrounds than being locked up in a hotel room.
His 6-year-old sister doesn't remember all the sights on the road.
And we started off, I forget, but I think Weston somewhere. I'm not sure.
International tourists are encouraged to travel this way.
The travel agents in Germany, many of them, are into the camping business in a big way, mainly because of the economics of it and the mobility that it gives you to see this country. The country is so vast and there's a lot of it you can't see from a hotel room.
Evelyn and Ernie Jones from Cheltenham, England, have driven their caravan throughout Europe before this trip to the U.S.
It's quite a popular thing, camping in England. The only thing we have against us, of course, is the weather.
So we go to Spain or Italy or somewhere like that.
Their daughter, living in Canada with her family, has followed in her parents' tracks.
Where with the trailer you can take off somewhere different. Like Dave said, we've seen probably more of the States than we have of Canada.
Al Garner from Pennsylvania wants to bring his family together and give his 8 kids a childhood they will remember.
Get out in the outside. Fresh air, exercise, just a great time.
He told me the advantage of taking 8 kids on a trip. They keep him from falling asleep at the steering wheel. Whether you choose to camp at national parks or at private sites, you won't ever be completely alone. That's because seeing America from the roadside has become a booming trend in travel. Steve Kaufman, WorldNet.
You see, the measurement of how much nudity there is, how many nudist camps or nudist beaches, I believe is not really a true measure of how literate and how enlightened a society is.
That's U.S. TV and radio sex therapist Dr. Ruth Westheimer. While there are those experts that agree that our feelings toward nudity do not reflect our sexual values, it is clear that distinct differences do exist in the way European and American cultures express nudity. Historically, such social differences can be evidenced in films. As early as 1955, renowned Swedish director Ingmar Bergman probed intense sexual desire, rarely seen on film before. Americans weren't ready to go that far on film. In their 1964 offering, Bikini Beach, the visual suggestiveness was used only as a backdrop for a wacky musical about America's youth. Bikini Beach was among a generation of sexy but innocent portrayals, a long way from the introspective honesty that foreign films were addressing.
The difference between Europe and the United States in terms of sexually speaking is really not so great. Yes, it's true that in Europe you see more magazines with topless women, you do see more magazines with actually nudity, but we in this country have much more knowledge about psychosexual therapy.
Some experts, however, disagree, saying the U.S.'s basic conservatism when it comes to nudity may contribute to diverse social problems, such as sexual crimes and personal sexual difficulties. Europeans have not shied away from exploring their sexuality, as in this 1983 sensuous comedy from France. Unlike the earlier American beach movies, this general acceptance of nudity in films mirrors their society's feelings toward the subject. No harm done. For a while, it looked like a phenomena when Americans flirted with the sexual revolution in the 60s. It peaked in 1969 at the Woodstock Rock Festival in upstate New York. 4 days of uninhibited personal expression for 500,000 people, captured here on film. But the music faded, and so did the social experiment.
If one particular society says that children can run around without bathing suits, and another society says, no, we ought to put on a bathing suit, that's not the issue. The issue is, do two people communicate with each other?
So while American instincts prefer to tease nudity and cover up the body, it is ironic that the U.S. is leading the world in scientific research on sexual awareness. Steve Kaufman, WorldNet.